On a frozen November night in the Nebraska Sandhills, a wild black stallion appeared at Tom Brennan's ranch gate, striking the metal bars with such force that sparks flew into the darkness. The horse's eyes blazed with an urgency that transcended instinct, and clutched between his teeth was something impossible. A leather strap connected to a trembling foal barely able to stand. What Tom discovered that night would unravel a web of lies, expose a ruthless man's greed, and prove that sometimes the most powerful truth comes on four legs. From that moment forward, a broken veterinarian, an orphaned boy, and two horses would stand against forces that wanted them erased. But in the end, they would discover that family isn't always born from blood. Sometimes it's forged in the fire of those willing to fight for what's right. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind moved across the sandhills like a living entity, bending the dried grasses until they whispered secrets to the enormous sky. Tom Brennan stood at his kitchen window, coffee growing cold in his hand, watching the sun sink behind the rolling prairie. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of gold and brown beneath a sky so vast it made him feel simultaneously insignificant and strangely anchored. He had chosen this isolation deliberately, the way a wounded animal seeks a quiet place to either heal or fade away. The ranch was small, just 200 acres that he barely maintained, but it offered what he needed most: distance from the person he used to be. 5 years ago, Tom had been Dr. Thomas Brennan, a respected veterinarian with a thriving practice in Omaha. He had owned a modern clinic, employed 4 people, and had a calendar booked solid for months. He had also had a wife, Rebecca, whose laughter could light up a room, and a daughter, Emma, who had wanted to follow in his footsteps and work with animals. That life ended on a Tuesday in March when a drunk driver ran a red light. Rebecca died instantly. Emma held on for 3 days before her small hand went limp in his. Tom had been at the clinic, elbows deep in a surgery on a golden retriever, when the call came. He saved the dog. He couldn't save his family. The guilt ate at him like acid. If he had been there, if he had driven them that day, if he had chosen a different route, a different time, a different anything. The practice became unbearable. Every healthy pet a reminder of his failure. Every grateful owner a knife twisting in his chest. He sold the clinic, packed what little mattered, and drove west until the buildings disappeared and the land opened up into something that matched the emptiness inside him. Brennan's Rest, the locals called it, though he had never named it that. The ranch had come with the name, along with a weathered house, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, and a silence so complete it sometimes rang in his ears. He rarely went to town. Dorothy Patterson, his neighbor 3 miles down the road, brought him supplies every few weeks, refusing payment and ignoring his protests. She was a widow herself, a retired schoolteacher with steel gray hair and eyes that saw too much. She never asked about his past, never pushed him to talk, but her presence was a quiet insistence that he remained tethered to the living world. Tom tolerated her visits because somewhere beneath the numbness, he recognized kindness, even when he felt he didn't deserve it. The November cold had arrived early this year, bringing with it a dryness that worried the old ranchers. The drought had stretched into its 3rd year, and water rights had become the currency of survival. Tom's property had a creek that still ran, fed by an underground spring that never seemed to fail, and that made his land more valuable than its size suggested. He had received 2 offers in the past year to sell, both from a man named Victor Ashford, and both offers had been refused without consideration. Tom wasn't interested in money. He was interested in being left alone. Tonight, the wind carried a sharpness that promised snow. Tom set his mug in the sink and pulled on his heavy coat, preparing for the evening check of the barn. He kept only 3 horses now, down from the dozen he had maintained when he first arrived. Caring for animals required a presence of mind he struggled to sustain, but these 3 were easy keepers, older geldings content to exist without demanding much from him. He grabbed the flashlight from the shelf and stepped out into the cold. The temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since sunset. His breath formed clouds that the wind immediately tore apart and carried across the prairie. The barn was a darker shadow against the deep blue of twilight, and as he approached, he heard something that made him stop. A sound, rhythmic and metallic, like something striking the gate at the far end of his property. He turned, flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness, and listened. There it was again, deliberate, insistent. Tom's pulse quickened for the first time in months. The gate was a quarter-mile from the house, bordering the open range where wild horse herds sometimes passed through. He had seen them occasionally, distant shapes moving like smoke across the grassland, beautiful and untouchable. But wild horses didn't approach human structures. They certainly didn't bang on gates. He started walking, boots crunching over frozen ground, the flashlight beam bouncing with each step. As he drew closer, the sound grew louder, more frantic. Then he saw it, a massive black horse rearing against his gate, hooves striking the metal bars with enough force to bend them. The stallion's coat gleamed like polished obsidian, mane whipping in the wind, and on his forehead was a perfect white star that caught the flashlight beam like a beacon. Tom's breath caught. He knew this horse. Years ago, when he had first arrived at the ranch, he had found a black stallion caught in barbed wire at the edge of his property, bleeding and panicked. Tom had spent 3 hours carefully cutting the animal free, talking in low tones, working with a patience he thought he had lost. When the horse finally pulled free, it had stood for a long moment, looking at Tom with eyes that held something too intelligent to dismiss, then vanished into the brakes. Tom had never seen it again. Until now. The stallion spotted him and stopped striking the gate. It backed up 3 steps, then lunged forward again, this time calling out, a sound that was part whinny, part scream, desperate and commanding. Tom approached slowly, hands visible, voice low. Easy now. Easy. What's wrong? The horse tossed its head violently, then turned its body, and that's when Tom saw it. A leather strap, crudely fashioned, clenched between the stallion's teeth. The strap was attached to a halter, and wearing that halter barely standing on legs that trembled. With exhaustion was a foal. Tom's heart slammed against his ribs. The foal couldn't have been more than 4 months old, its black coat dull and matted, ribs showing through the skin. Its eyes were half closed, head hanging low, and even from several feet away Tom could see it was in severe distress. The stallion pulled against the strap, trying to drag the foal closer to the gate, to Tom, and the meaning was unmistakable. Help! Tom fumbled with the gate latch, fingers clumsy with cold and shock, and swung it wide. The stallion immediately pulled the foal through, then released the strap and stepped back, breathing hard, steam pouring from his nostrils. Tom dropped to his knees beside the foal. His veterinary instincts, dormant for so long, roared back to life. He ran his hands over the small body, feeling for injuries, checking vital signs. The foal's heartbeat was rapid and weak, its breathing shallow. Severe dehydration, possible pneumonia, hypothermia setting in. The foal's temperature would be dangerously low, and without immediate intervention, it wouldn't survive the night. Tom looked up at the stallion, whose dark eyes were fixed on him with an intensity that bordered on human. You brought her to me. The horse stamped once, a sound like a judge's gavel. Without another thought, Tom scooped the foal into his arms. It was heavier than it looked, dead weight that spoke of a body shutting down. He turned and ran toward the barn, the stallion following 3 paces behind, hooves striking the frozen ground in rhythm with Tom's pounding heart. Inside the barn, the lights seemed too bright after the darkness. Tom's 3 geldings shifted nervously in their stalls, eyes rolling at the intrusion of the wild stallion, but Tom ignored them. He carried the foal to an empty stall that he quickly filled with fresh straw, then laid the small body down as gently as possible. His mind raced through treatments, warm fluids, electrolytes, antibiotics. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. If there was infection. He had supplies, leftovers from his old life that he had never been able to throw away, stored in a cabinet at the back of the barn. Tom sprinted to it, throwing open doors, grabbing bottles and syringes, his hands moving with a certainty they hadn't possessed in years. He mixed a solution of warm water, electrolytes, and glucose, drew it into a large syringe, and returned to the foal. Kneeling in the straw, he carefully opened the foal's mouth and began to drip the mixture onto its tongue, a slow process that required patience and precision. The black stallion stood at the stall door, head over the top rail, watching every move Tom made. There was no aggression in the horse's posture, only vigilance, the stance of a guardian who had delivered a precious charge and would not leave until he knew it was safe. Tom worked for over an hour, administering fluids, wrapping the foal in blankets he retrieved from the house, checking and rechecking vitals. Slowly, agonizingly, the foal's condition began to stabilize. His breathing deepened, the trembling eased. When Tom pressed his stethoscope to its chest, the heartbeat was still weak but steadier. He sat back on his heels, exhaustion crashing over him. His hands were shaking, not from cold but from the adrenaline draining away. He looked at the foal, at the rise and fall of its small ribcage, and felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Purpose. This life, this fragile, struggling life, was depending on him. And for the first time since losing Emma and Rebecca, Tom wanted desperately not to fail. He became aware of movement and turned to find the stallion had somehow opened the stall door and stepped inside. The horse moved past Tom with a grace that belied its size and lowered its head to the foal, breathing softly over its face. The foal's eyes fluttered open, just for a moment, and a weak sound escaped its throat. The stallion nickered in response, a low rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the straw. Tom watched, transfixed. This was not normal horse behavior. Wild stallions didn't form attachments to foals that weren't part of their herd, didn't risk exposure to humans, didn't display this level of deliberate communication. He studied the foal more carefully in the lamplight and noticed something he had missed before. Around its neck, beneath the halter, was a thin collar. Not leather, but something synthetic. He leaned closer, brushing the matted fur aside, and his breath caught. It was a medical collar, the kind used for identification, and embedded in it was a small capsule. Tom's fingers found the seam and twisted it open. Inside was a microchip, standard for registering purebred horses, and a tightly rolled piece of paper. He pulled out the paper and unrolled it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, hurried, but legible. If you find Shadow, protect her. She is proof. Lucas Whitfield. Tom read it 3 times, his mind working to make sense of it. Lucas Whitfield. The name was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. Shadow must be the foal. But proof of what? And why would someone send a dying foal out into the prairie with a wild stallion? He looked up at the black horse, whose eyes seemed to hold answers Tom couldn't access. What happened? Where did she come from? The stallion turned and walked out of the stall, moving to the barn door. He stood there, silhouetted against the night, and looked back at Tom. Then, without warning, he reared, striking the air with his front hooves, a display of power and frustration. He landed and bolted into the darkness, hoofbeats fading into the wind. Tom stood slowly, the piece of paper clenched in his fist, and felt the first stirrings of something he had thought died with his family. Anger, not at fate or drunk drivers or the universe, but at the concrete injustice of someone harming this foal, of someone frightening a boy badly enough that he would send his horse into the wild with a plea for help. He looked down at Shadow, who had slipped back into an exhausted sleep, her breathing finally even and deep. Protect her. She is proof. Tom folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know what he was protecting her from or what she was proof of, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let this foal die. He would not fail again. He pulled a stool into the stall and sat down, prepared to keep watch through the night. Outside, the wind howled across the sandhills, and somewhere in the darkness, a wild black stallion stood sentinel, waiting for the dawn and whatever battle it would bring. The barn's warmth was a small pocket of safety against the cold pressing in from all sides. Tom checked Shadow's vitals every 30 minutes, adjusting blankets, administering more fluids, monitoring the slow but steady improvement. Around midnight, he heard the crunch of tires on gravel and saw headlights sweep across the barn wall. He tensed, hand instinctively moving toward the pitchfork leaning against the stall, then relaxed when he recognized the sound of Dorothy Patterson's ancient pickup truck. She appeared in the doorway moments later, bundled in a coat that had seen better decades, her face sharp with concern. "Tom Brennan," she said without preamble. "I saw your lights burning from the road and figured something was wrong. You planning to tell me what's going on? Or do I have to guess?" Tom gestured toward the stall. Dorothy peered over the rail, her expression shifting from irritation to shock. "Lord have mercy," she whispered. "Where did that baby come from?" "The brakes," Tom said. "A black stallion brought her to my gate. Begged me to help." Dorothy's eyes snapped to his. "Midnight?" Tom blinked. "You know him?" "Know of him," Dorothy corrected. "Every rancher in 3 counties knows of him. Wild as the wind, smart as they come, and mean as a snake if you try to catch him. Except he's not mean. He just wants to be left alone." She stepped into the stall, kneeling with a grace that belied her age, and ran expert hands over the foal. "This one's been cared for," she said quietly. "Look at her hooves, trimmed proper. And that halter's custom fit. This isn't some wild Mustang baby. She's bred, and bred well if I'm any judge." Tom pulled the paper from his pocket and handed it to Dorothy. She read it, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Lucas Whitfield," she repeated. "Oh, Tom, do you know what you've stumbled into?" Tom shook his head. Dorothy sat back on her heels, her eyes distant. "James Whitfield owned a horse breeding operation about 20 miles east of here," she began. "Whitfield Meadows. Finest quarter horses in the state, bloodlines going back 50 years. James was a good man, fair and honest. He died 8 months ago, left everything to his boy, Lucas. The kid's 16, trying to hold the ranch together on his own. But there's a problem. Victor Ashford." The name hit Tom like a fist. The developer who had been trying to buy his land. "What about him?" Dorothy's expression hardened. "Ashford wants Whitfield Meadows. The land sits on top of one of the best aquifers in the county. Spring-fed, never runs dry even in drought. Ashford's planning some monstrosity called Prairie Vista Estates. Luxury homes for rich folks from Omaha and Lincoln. Needs water rights to make it work. He's been pressuring Lucas to sell, made offers, threats, you name it." Tom looked at the foal, pieces clicking into place. "So Shadow is what? Leverage? Proof of ownership," Dorothy said. "If Lucas can prove the breeding program is legitimate and profitable, he has a case for keeping the land. But if the horses disappear, if there's no stock to show, then Ashford can claim the ranch is abandoned, push through some legal nonsense, and take it." She met Tom's eyes. "If Ashford finds out you have this foal, he'll come for her. And he won't ask nicely." Tom felt his jaw tighten. "Let him come." Dorothy studied him for a long moment, then smiled, a fierce expression that took years off her face. "There's the man I've been waiting to meet," she said. "About time you woke up, Tom Brennan." They worked together through the rest of the night, taking turns monitoring Shadow, brewing coffee that tasted like tar but kept them alert, and planning. By dawn, the foal was strong enough to lift her head, her eyes clearer, focusing on Tom with an awareness that made his chest tighten. Dorothy had left just before sunrise, promising to return with supplies and information. Tom stood in the barn doorway, watching the sky lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gold of morning. The prairie stretched before him, empty and vast, but he no longer felt alone. Somewhere out there, a boy named Lucas was waiting, hoping, trusting that someone had found his message. And somewhere closer, a black stallion named Midnight stood watch, a guardian who had chosen Tom for reasons he was only beginning to understand. Tom looked back at Shadow, who was now standing on shaky legs, nosing at the hay he had scattered in the stall. "She is proof," the note had said. Proof of what? Tom wasn't entirely sure yet. But he knew this much: whatever battle was coming, he would stand and face it. Not because he was brave, but because for the first time in 5 years he had something worth fighting for. Something beyond his own grief. A purpose that demanded he be more than the broken shell he had become. He walked back into the barn, closing the door against the cold, and sat down on the stool beside Shadow's stall. The foal looked at him, dark eyes holding a trust he didn't feel he deserved, but would spend every moment trying to earn. Outside, the wind whispered across the sandhills, carrying with it the promise of storms ahead, both weather and human. But inside the barn, a small light had been lit, and Tom Brennan, for the first time since losing everything, allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, broken things could be made whole again. The morning light filtered through the barn's dusty windows, painting golden stripes across the straw-covered floor. Tom had dozed off sometime around 5, his body slumped against the stall wall, and when he jerked awake, the first thing he saw was Shadow standing on all 4 legs, her head lowered to a bucket of water Dorothy must have filled before she left. The foal drank in small, careful sips, and the sight sent relief flooding through Tom's chest. He had kept something alive. For one night, at least, he had not failed. He stood slowly, joints protesting from hours spent on hard ground, and checked his watch. 7:15. The sun was fully up now, and the temperature inside the barn had risen enough that he could see his breath only faintly. Shadow lifted her head at his movement, water dripping from her muzzle, and regarded him with an expression that seemed almost questioning. Tom stepped into the stall, moving with deliberate slowness, and ran his hand along her neck. Her coat was still rough, still showed the evidence of neglect and exposure, but beneath his palm he could feel warmth returning, life asserting itself against the cold that had nearly claimed her. He conducted a more thorough examination in the daylight, his veterinary training taking over with a familiarity that was both comforting and painful. Shadow's lungs sounded clearer, though there was still a faint rattle that concerned him. Possible early pneumonia, treatable with antibiotics if he started them soon. Her heart rate was stronger, more regular. The dehydration was improving but not resolved. She would need continued fluid support throughout the day. Her legs, though shaky, bore her weight without obvious pain. No fractures, no tendon damage. She had been lucky, or perhaps Midnight had been careful in how he transported her through the breaks. Tom examined the microchip collar more closely in the light. The technology was standard for registered horses, used by breeders to track bloodlines and ownership. He would need a scanner to read the chip's information, and he had sold all his veterinary equipment when he closed the practice. Dorothy would know someone in town who could help, or perhaps he would have to risk a trip to Ridgeway himself. The thought of entering town, of facing curious stares and inevitable questions, made his stomach tighten, but he pushed the discomfort aside. This wasn't about his comfort anymore. He retrieved the note from his pocket and read it again in full light. The handwriting was definitely a teenager's, the letters formed with the awkward precision of someone still learning to write in cursive. If you find Shadow, protect her. She is proof. Lucas Whitfield. The paper was torn from a larger sheet, the edges ragged, and there were stains on it that might have been water or might have been something else. Blood, perhaps. Tom's jaw tightened. What had happened at Whitfield Meadows? What had driven a 16-year-old boy to send his horse into the wilderness with a wild stallion? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of an engine approaching, heavier than Dorothy's pickup. Tom moved to the barn door and looked out to see an unfamiliar black SUV pulling into his yard, its chrome gleaming in the morning sun. The vehicle was expensive, out of place against the weathered backdrop of his ranch. It stopped near the house and 2 men stepped out. The first was older, maybe 50, dressed in a long wool coat that probably cost more than Tom's truck. His hair was silver at the temples, his face handsome in a practiced way, and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The second man was younger, broad-shouldered, wearing a sheriff's deputy uniform. Tom recognized neither of them, but instinct told him exactly who the older man was. Victor Ashford. Tom stepped out of the barn, closing the door behind him, and walked toward them with measured steps. He kept his expression neutral, his body language neither welcoming nor hostile, simply waiting. Ashford smiled, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes, and extended his hand. Mr. Brennan, I presume? I'm Victor Ashford. I believe I've written to you a few times about purchasing your property. Tom ignored the offered hand. I'm not interested in selling. Ashford's smile didn't waver, but something cold flickered behind it. Of course. I respect a man who values his land. Actually, I'm here on a different matter this morning. The deputy stepped forward, his hand resting casually on his belt near his weapon. Tom noticed the nameplate, Summers. The young man's face was professionally blank, but his eyes were alert, scanning the property. Deputy Rick Summers, the man said, "We're looking for stolen property. A foal, black coat, about 4 months old, taken from the Whitfield property 2 nights ago. We have reason to believe it might have wandered onto neighboring ranches." Tom's heart rate increased, but his face remained impassive. "I haven't seen any stray horses." Ashford stepped closer, his cologne sharp in the cold air. "You're sure? It's worth quite a bit of money, Mr. Brennan. There might even be a reward for its safe return." Tom met his gaze without blinking. "I said I haven't seen it." Ashford studied him for a long moment, then glanced past him toward the barn. "You wouldn't mind if we took a quick look around, would you? Just to be thorough." Tom felt his muscles tense. "You have a warrant?" Deputy Summers shifted his weight. "We don't need a warrant if you consent to a search, Mr. Brennan. And refusing might make us wonder what you're hiding." Tom's mind raced. Shadow was in the barn, clearly visible to anyone who walked through. He couldn't hide her, couldn't lie if they found her. But something in Ashford's demeanor, the way he was too interested, too insistent, told Tom that letting these men into his barn would be a mistake he couldn't undo. Before he could respond, another vehicle approached, this one Dorothy's familiar pickup. It rattled into the yard and stopped between Tom and the SUV. Dorothy climbed out, moving with surprising speed, and planted herself next to Tom. "Victor Ashford," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Didn't expect to see you slithering around before breakfast." "Mrs. Patterson," Ashford replied smoothly. "Always a pleasure. What brings you here?" Dorothy folded her arms. "I live 3 miles down the road, which is more than I can say for you. Last I checked, you had no business on Tom's property unless he invited you, which I'm guessing he didn't." Ashford's smile tightened. "We're conducting an investigation into a theft. If Mr. Brennan has nothing to hide, there should be no problem with a brief search." Dorothy snorted. "Investigation? That's rich, coming from a man who's been trying to steal the Whitfield boys' land for months. How exactly did this foal get stolen, Victor? You have any proof of that? Or are you just making accusations because it suits your purposes?" Deputy Summers cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we have a report filed by Mr. Ashford stating that property from the Whitfield estate, which he now manages, has gone missing. We're following up on all leads." Dorothy's eyes narrowed. "Manages? James Whitfield left that ranch to his son. Since when does Victor Ashford manage anything that doesn't line his own pockets?" Ashford's facade cracked slightly, irritation showing through. "The Whitfield property is in probate, Mrs. Patterson. The boy is a minor and cannot legally operate a business of that scale. The court appointed me as temporary custodian until matters are settled." "Temporary custodian," Dorothy repeated, her voice rising. "Is that what you call it when you move in the day after a man's buried and start selling off his stock?" Tom saw an opening and took it. "Gentlemen, I've told you I haven't seen your missing foal. If you have legitimate concerns, come back with a warrant. Until then, I'd appreciate it if you left my property." Deputy Summers looked uncomfortable, glancing between Tom and Ashford. Ashford's expression hardened, the veneer of civility dropping away. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Brennan. This valley runs on cooperation. People who refuse to cooperate tend to find life very difficult." "Is that a threat?" Tom asked quietly. Ashford smiled again, and this time it was all edges. "It's a reality. Ask the Whitfield boy how cooperation works out." He turned and walked back to the SUV, Deputy Summers following after a moment's hesitation. The vehicle reversed, turned, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the cold air. Tom waited until the SUV disappeared down the road before he let out the breath he had been holding. Dorothy touched his arm. That was Ashford showing his hand. He knows something or he suspects. Either way, he's not going to let this go. Tom nodded slowly. "He said he manages the Whitfield property. Is that true?" Dorothy's expression was grim. It's complicated. James Whitfield died without a formal will, just a handwritten note leaving everything to Lucas. Ashford got himself appointed by the county court as a temporary administrator, claimed the boy needed adult supervision to handle the estate. But everyone knows what he's really doing. He's stripping the place, selling horses, equipment, anything valuable, trying to force Lucas out so he can claim the land. Tom thought of the note, of Lucas's desperate plea. Where is Lucas now? Hiding, Dorothy said. The boy's smart enough to know Ashford would try to get control of him too. Put him in some group home or foster situation where he couldn't fight back. Last I heard, he was staying with different families, moving around, trying to keep out of sight. Tom looked toward the barn where Shadow waited. He sent her with Midnight. Why would he do that? Dorothy followed his gaze. Because that foal is the last offspring of Whitfield's champion mare, Sable Dream. The mare's bloodline is worth hundreds of thousands. Maybe more. If Lucas has Shadow, he can prove the breeding program is viable, that the ranch is a functioning business. Without her, Ashford can claim there's nothing left to preserve, that the property is just empty land. Tom felt the pieces clicking together. So Ashford needs Shadow gone. Dead, disappeared, doesn't matter. As long as she's not there to prove Lucas has a legitimate claim. Dorothy nodded. And now she's in your barn, which makes you part of this whether you want to be or not. Tom was silent for a long moment, staring at the horizon where the prairie met the sky. He thought about the past 5 years, about the isolation he had wrapped around himself like armor, about the careful numbness he had cultivated to keep the pain at bay. He thought about Emma, who had loved every animal she met, who had begged him for riding lessons, who had dreamed of being a veterinarian like her father. She would have fought for Shadow without a second thought. I need to find Lucas, Tom said finally. Dorothy smiled, fierce and approving. I was hoping you'd say that. Tom spent the rest of the morning caring for Shadow, administering antibiotics he found in his old supplies, changing her bedding, coaxing her to eat small amounts of softened grain. The foal was responding well, gaining strength with each hour, and by noon she was moving around the stall with more confidence. Tom found himself talking to her as he worked, a habit from his veterinary days, explaining what he was doing, why it mattered. Shadow seemed to listen, her dark eyes following his movements, and occasionally she would step closer and rest her head against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that broke something open inside him. Dorothy returned in the early afternoon with a truck bed full of supplies, feed, blankets, medical equipment, and a portable scanner for reading microchips. She also brought news. Lucas Whitfield was currently staying with the Garrison family, about 15 miles north. Helen Garrison was an elderly widow who had bought horses from James Whitfield for years and had no love for Victor Ashford. She would help them make contact. Tom loaded the scanner and followed Dorothy's directions to prepare it. When he passed the device over Shadow's collar, it beeped and displayed a registration number along with basic information. Shadow's Whisper, sired by Midnight's Echo out of Sable Dream, born July 14th. Registered with the American Quarter Horse Association. Owner James Whitfield, Whitfield Meadows. Midnight's Echo, Tom repeated, looking at Dorothy. The black stallion. He's the father. Dorothy's eyes widened. That's impossible. Midnight's Echo was James's prize stud, but he escaped during a storm 2 years ago. James searched for months, never found him. Everyone assumed he died in the breaks or got taken by wolves. Tom shook his head slowly. He didn't die. He went wild. And somehow he came back for his daughter. The implications hung between them, too strange to fully articulate. A wild stallion who remembered his former life, who understood enough to bring his offspring to a human who could help. It defied explanation, yet the evidence was undeniable. Shadow existed. Midnight had brought her. The microchip confirmed the connection. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Tom stood in the barn doorway and watched the horizon. He was thinking about destiny, about the strange paths that led a broken veterinarian and a desperate boy and a wild stallion to intersect in a moment that might change everything. He was thinking about Emma, about how she used to say that animals knew things people didn't, that they could sense goodness and danger, that they chose their friends carefully. He was thinking about the 5 years he had spent trying to disappear, and how in a single night, life had found him anyway and demanded he show up. Dorothy appeared beside him, 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She offered one to Tom, and they stood in comfortable silence, watching the light fade. "You know this is going to get ugly," she said eventually. "Ashford doesn't lose gracefully." Tom sipped the coffee, bitter and strong. "I know. You ready for that?" Tom thought about the question. Was he ready? He had spent years running from anything that required him to be present, to care, to risk loss again. But standing here, with Shadow recovering in the stall behind him and Lucas Whitfield counting on a stranger to do the right thing, Tom realized that readiness wasn't the point. Some things you did regardless of whether you felt ready. Some fights you took simply because they were right. "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "But I'm done hiding." Dorothy smiled and clinked her coffee cup against his. "Then I guess we'd better get prepared, because tomorrow we find Lucas, and the day after that all hell's probably going to break loose." Tom nodded, feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Took him a moment to recognize it. Not hope exactly, not yet, but something close. Determination, maybe, or purpose. The knowledge that for the first time in 5 years, his life meant something beyond simple survival. He had been given a second chance to save something that mattered, and he would burn his ranch to the ground before he let Victor Ashford take it away. Inside the barn, Shadow nickered softly, a sound of contentment, and somewhere far out in the breaks, a wild black stallion lifted his head to the rising moon and called out. A promise carried on the wind that he was watching, that he would return, that the battle for his daughter's life was only beginning. Tom heard that distant cry and felt it settle into his bones. The wounded protagonist was wounded no longer. He had found his cause, and he would see it through to whatever end awaited, because some things, some lives, were worth fighting for. And in the protection of one small foal, Tom Brennan would rediscover the man he used to be, before grief had hollowed him out. The veterinarian who saved lives. The father who would have moved mountains for his daughter. The human being who still believed, despite everything, that goodness could prevail against greed if only someone was brave enough to stand in its path. The dawn broke cold and clear, the kind of morning where the air felt crystalline and every sound carried for miles across the frozen prairie. Tom had spent another night in the barn, unwilling to leave Shadow alone for more than a few minutes. And when he finally stepped outside to stretch his cramped muscles, he found the world transformed. A light snow had fallen during the night, just enough to dust the landscape in white, and the silence was so complete it seemed to hum in his ears. He stood on the threshold between barn and yard, coffee steaming in his hand, and listened to that silence with an attention he hadn't given anything in years. Then he heard it, a sound that shouldn't exist in nature, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond his eastern fence line. Hoofbeats, but not the random wandering of grazing horses. These were purposeful, moving in a pattern that suggested intelligence and intent. Tom set down his coffee and walked toward the sound, his boots leaving the first tracks in the fresh snow. The sun was just beginning to crest the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and pink, and in that light he saw something that made him stop and question whether he was still asleep. Midnight stood at the fence line, exactly where he had been 2 nights ago when he brought Shadow. But the stallion wasn't alone. Behind him, arranged in a perfect semicircle, were 6 more horses. Wild mustangs, their coats shaggy with winter growth, their eyes alert and watchful. They stood motionless, not grazing, not moving, simply waiting. Midnight himself was positioned at the center, his massive frame dominating the group, and as Tom approached, the stallion lifted his head and released a sound that was neither whinny nor neigh but something deeper, more resonant. It rolled across the prairie like thunder, and every horse in the semicircle raised their heads in unison, as if responding to a command. Tom's rational mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Horses were herd animals, yes, capable of complex social structures and communication. But this was something else entirely. This was organization. This was intent. The way Midnight stood, the way the others positioned themselves, it looked less like a wild herd and more like a council, or an army awaiting orders. Tom felt the hair on the back of his neck rise, that primal response to witnessing something that defied natural explanation. He reached the fence and stopped, making no move to cross it or approach closer. Midnight watched him with those impossibly intelligent eyes, and Tom found himself speaking without planning the words. "You brought her to me. She's safe." The stallion stamped once, a sharp crack against the frozen ground. Then he turned his head and looked back at the assembled horses. One of them, a gray mare with a scarred shoulder, stepped forward. She moved past Midnight, came to the fence, and lowered her head, presenting her neck to Tom. He saw immediately what she was showing him. Barbed wire wounds, relatively fresh, cutting across her withers and down her shoulder. Someone had tried to trap her, and she had fought her way free. Tom's veterinary instincts took over. He studied the wounds from where he stood, assessing depth and infection risk. The cuts were clean, suggesting recent injury, and while they had stopped bleeding, they needed treatment or they would fester. Without thinking, Tom climbed over the fence, moving slowly, hands visible. The mare didn't shy away. She stood perfectly still as he examined the injuries up close, his fingers gentle on the torn hide. "These need cleaning," he said quietly, speaking more to himself than the horse. "Antibiotic ointment. You're lucky they're not deeper." The mare turned her head and looked at him, and in her eyes Tom saw something that stopped his breath. Recognition. Not of him specifically, but of what he represented. Help. Healing. She knew he could fix this. She had been brought here, presented to him, because Midnight had communicated somehow that this human could be trusted. Tom looked back at the stallion, who stood watching with that same unwavering focus. "You're bringing me patience," Tom said, half question, half statement of disbelief. Midnight tossed his head, mane flying, and stamped again. The sound echoed like punctuation. "Yes." Tom's mind reeled. This wasn't possible. Wild horses didn't seek out veterinary care. They didn't understand human medicine. They certainly didn't organize themselves to bring injured herd members to a stranger's fence. Yet here it was, happening in front of him, undeniable and impossible in equal measure. He thought about Shadow, about how Midnight had carried her through miles of dangerous terrain to reach this specific ranch. Not just any ranch. Tom's ranch. The stallion had chosen him deliberately, and now he was expanding that choice, bringing others who needed help. The implications were staggering. If Midnight had this level of intelligence, this capacity for reasoning and planning, then what Tom was witnessing wasn't animal instinct. It was something closer to consciousness, to deliberate thought. The stallion had assessed a situation, identified a solution, and executed a plan. He had remembered Tom from years ago, remembered the kindness shown when he was trapped in barbed wire, and had filed that memory away until the moment it became useful. That suggested not just intelligence but gratitude, foresight, and trust. Tom realized he was trembling, not from cold but from the sheer weight of what he was understanding. The world he thought he knew, where animals operated on instinct and humans held a monopoly on complex thought, had just revealed itself to be far more mysterious. He looked at the gray mare, at the expectation in her eyes, and made a decision that felt less like choice and more like acceptance of an invitation he couldn't refuse. "Wait here," he said, then felt foolish for speaking to creatures who couldn't understand English. Except the mare didn't move. She stood exactly where she was, as if she had understood perfectly. Tom climbed back over the fence and jogged to the barn, his mind racing through what supplies he would need. Antiseptic wash, antibiotic ointment, gauze, his medical kit. He grabbed everything, stuffing it into a canvas bag, then paused at Shadow's stall. The foal was awake, standing near the water bucket, and when she saw Tom, she nickered softly. He stepped inside and ran a hand along her neck. "Your father's out there," he told her, "doing something I can't explain." She butted her head against his chest, and he smiled despite the strangeness of the morning. "Stay here. I'll be back." When he returned to the fence, the horses hadn't moved. The gray mare was still waiting, and Midnight stood like a statue, patient and commanding. Tom climbed over with his bag and approached the mare again. This time he worked quickly, cleaning the wounds with practiced efficiency, applying ointment, checking for signs of infection. The mare stood perfectly still throughout, not even flinching when the antiseptic must have stung. When Tom finished, he stepped back and the mare shook herself, then turned and walked back to the semicircle, taking her place among the others. For a moment nothing happened. Then Midnight made a sound, low and rumbling, and two more horses stepped forward. A young stallion with a gash on his foreleg. A buckskin with what looked like an abscess on his hoof. Tom stared, understanding flooding through him. Midnight had brought an entire clinic's worth of patience. The stallion wasn't just seeking help for Shadow. He was establishing something bigger, a relationship, a network of trust. Tom looked at his watch. 7:30. Dorothy would be arriving soon with breakfast. He needed to work fast. He treated the young stallion first, cleaning and bandaging the leg wound, then moved to the buckskin. The hoof abscess was more serious, requiring him to carefully drain it and pack it with medicated clay. The horse stood motionless throughout the procedure, trusting in a way that wild animals simply didn't trust humans. When Tom finished with the buckskin, he waited to see if more would come forward, but the remaining horses simply watched. Midnight stepped forward then, closing the distance between them, and lowered his great head until his muzzle was inches from Tom's face. Tom stood frozen, barely breathing. The stallion's breath was warm against his skin, and he could see his own reflection in those dark, bottomless eyes. For a long moment they stayed like that, man and horse, locked in a communion that transcended species. Then Midnight exhaled, a long, slow breath that seemed to carry meaning Tom couldn't quite grasp, and stepped back. The stallion reared, magnificent and powerful, silhouetted against the rising sun. He came down and turned, and the entire group moved as one, flowing away from the fence and back toward the brakes. Within minutes they were gone, vanished into the landscape as if they had never been there at all. Tom stood alone in the snow, his medical bag at his feet, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. The rational part of his brain insisted there had to be an explanation. Conditioning, perhaps. Maybe James Whitfield had trained Midnight extensively before the stallion escaped, had taught him to associate humans with healing. But that didn't explain the organization, the deliberate presentation of multiple injured horses, the way Midnight had clearly communicated expectations to his herd. That went beyond training. That was something else entirely. Dorothy's truck pulled into the yard, and Tom turned to see her climbing out, a thermos in one hand and a paper bag in the other. She took one look at his face and set both items on the truck's hood. What happened? Tom gestured toward the fence line, toward the tracks in the snow that proved he hadn't imagined it. Midnight came back, brought 6 other horses with him. 3 of them were injured. He wanted me to treat them. Dorothy's eyes widened. He brought you patients? Tom nodded slowly, like he's building a practice, like he understands what I am and what I can do, and he's telling the other horses that this place is safe. Dorothy walked to the fence and studied the tracks. The snow had captured everything perfectly, the hoof prints arranged in that impossible semicircle, the smaller tracks where Tom had climbed over and moved between the horses. She traced the pattern with her eyes, and when she looked back at Tom, her expression was unsettled. I've lived in these sandhills my whole life, she said quietly. I've seen horses do remarkable things. But this, Tom, this isn't normal. This is something else. I know, Tom said. The question is, what do we do about it? They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun climb higher, burning away the pink and gold of dawn and replacing it with the harsh clarity of full morning. Finally, Dorothy spoke. James Whitfield used to say that Midnight was special. Not just smart for a horse, but truly intelligent. He said the stallion understood things, could read situations, could almost think ahead. Most people dismissed it as a proud owner's exaggeration. But maybe James knew something we're only just figuring out. Tom thought about Shadow in the barn, about the note Lucas had hidden in her collar, about Midnight's desperate journey to bring his daughter to safety. What if it runs in the bloodline? What if Shadow has it too? Dorothy's expression shifted, understanding dawning. Then she's not just valuable because of her breeding papers. She's valuable because of what she is, what she might become. And if Ashford figures that out, Tom finished, he won't just want her gone. He'll want to study her, exploit her, turn whatever makes her special into something he can profit from. They looked at each other, the weight of this new understanding settling between them. What had seemed like a simple property dispute, a fight over land and water rights, had just revealed another dimension entirely. Shadow wasn't just proof of Lucas's claim to the ranch. She was something potentially unprecedented, a window into a level of animal intelligence that would revolutionize everything humans thought they knew about horses. Tom felt his chest tighten with the responsibility of it. He had thought he was just protecting a sick foal. Now he realized he was protecting something far more significant. If the scientific community learned about Midnight, about what Tom had witnessed this morning, the stallion would never know freedom again. He would be captured, studied, confined. The same fate would await Shadow if her abilities manifested. Tom looked toward the breaks, toward the place where Midnight had vanished. The stallion had trusted him with something precious. Not just his daughter's life, but the secret of his own extraordinary nature. "I can't tell anyone about this," Tom said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever." Dorothy nodded slowly. "Agreed. But Tom, that means when people ask questions, when Ashford starts digging, we have to have a story that makes sense. We can't let anyone suspect there's more to this than a simple rescue." Tom thought for a moment. "We tell them I found Shadow wandering on my property, near death from exposure. No mention of Midnight bringing her deliberately. We say she must have escaped from somewhere and got lost in the storm." Dorothy considered this. "That works, but only if we can explain the microchip, the collar, the note from Lucas. Those things prove she didn't just wander. We say Lucas released her himself," Tom said, the story forming as he spoke. He was scared of Ashford, knew he couldn't protect her. So he turned her loose hoping she'd find her way to safety. The note was his way of asking whoever found her to help. It's not that far from the truth, just leaves out the part about Midnight. Dorothy tested the logic, looking for holes. Why would Lucas release her into a storm? That seems cruel. Because he had no choice, Tom answered. Maybe Ashford's men were coming. Maybe it was release her or watch them take her. A desperate decision by a desperate kid. Dorothy nodded slowly. That could work. People would believe that. They spent the next hour refining the story, making sure every detail aligned, anticipating questions and preparing answers. By the time they finished, Tom felt reasonably confident they could weather scrutiny, at least the initial round. But he also knew that lies, even necessary ones, had a way of unraveling under pressure. They would have to be careful, consistent, and above all, they would have to keep Midnight's true nature hidden. The stallion's intelligence was both Shadow's greatest protection and her greatest vulnerability. As long as people thought they were dealing with ordinary horses, the situation remained manageable. If anyone suspected otherwise, everything would spiral out of control. Tom returned to the barn to check on Shadow and found her lying down in the fresh straw, looking more comfortable than she had since arriving. She lifted her head when he entered and made a soft sound, somewhere between greeting and contentment. He sat beside her, running his hand along her neck, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing. "You're special, aren't you?" he said quietly, "like your father. I don't know what that means yet, or what you'll be capable of when you're grown. But I promise you this, I won't let anyone turn you into an experiment. I won't let them cage you or study you or take away whatever wildness makes you who you are." Shadow shifted closer, resting her head on his lap, and Tom felt tears sting his eyes for the first time in years. Not tears of grief, though grief was still there, woven into everything he was. These were different. Tears of purpose, of connection, of the overwhelming responsibility of protecting something irreplaceable. He thought about Emma, about how she would have loved this foal, would have spent hours in this stall talking to her, imagining the horse she would become. He thought about Rebecca, who had always believed Tom's best self emerged when he was caring for animals, when he let compassion override caution. Maybe they had sent him this in some cosmic sense that defied logic. Maybe this was their way of pulling him back from the edge of permanent withdrawal, of giving him a reason to fight again. Or maybe it was just chance, random collision of need and capability. Either way, Tom knew he had been changed. The man who had stood in this barn 2 nights ago, numb and disconnected, no longer existed. In his place was someone who had been reminded what it meant to care, to hope, to believe that his actions could matter. Dorothy appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the bright morning. "Tom," she said gently, "we need to go. The Garrisons are expecting us in an hour." Tom looked down at Shadow, reluctant to leave her. Dorothy seemed to read his thoughts. "She'll be fine for a few hours. I'll ask Frank Drummond to come by and check on her. He's trustworthy, won't ask too many questions." Tom nodded and carefully extracted himself from beneath the foal's head. He gave her one last pat and followed Dorothy out into the cold. As they drove north toward the Garrison place, Tom found himself watching the landscape with new eyes. The prairie had always seemed empty to him, a vast nothing that reflected the void inside him. But now he saw it differently. Out there, somewhere in those rolling hills and hidden canyons, Midnight roamed with his herd. The stallion was watching, waiting, trusting that Tom would keep his daughter safe. And somewhere else, a 16-year-old boy was hiding, hoping that the message he sent into the storm had reached someone who would answer. The prairie wasn't empty. It was full of hidden lives, intersecting paths, stories waiting to be written. "They're going to come for her," Tom said, breaking the silence. "Ashford and whoever he's working with. They'll figure out she's at my place eventually." Dorothy kept her eyes on the road. "I know, which means we need to move fast. Get Lucas to safety, secure Shadow's registration, build a case strong enough that Ashford can't just take what he wants through threats and forged documents." Tom leaned back in his seat. "How do we do that?" Dorothy smiled grimly. "The same way you fight any bully. You shine light on what they're doing. Make it public. Get enough people watching that they can't operate in the shadows anymore." Tom thought about the town, about Deputy Summers and the way he had deferred to Ashford, about the reality of small community politics where money often spoke louder than justice. "It won't be easy." "No," Dorothy agreed. "But nothing worth doing ever is." They drove on through the morning, the truck rattling over gravel roads, kicking up dust that hung in the cold air. Tom watched the sun climb higher and thought about Midnight's eyes, about the intelligence he had seen there, about the trust that had been placed in him by a creature who had every reason to fear humans. He thought about the semicircle of horses, about the gray mare presenting her wounds, about the young stallion standing perfectly still while Tom bandaged his leg. Natural order had been disrupted this morning. The boundary between human and animal, between conscious and instinctive, had blurred in ways Tom couldn't fully articulate. He had been chosen for something, called to a purpose that transcended the simple rescue of a foal. Midnight had looked at him and seen something worth trusting, worth building a relationship upon. And in accepting that trust, Tom had crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross. He was part of something now, something larger and stranger than he could have imagined when he fled to these sandhills 5 years ago seeking only silence and oblivion. The supernatural call had been answered, not with words or conscious decision, but with action. Tom had treated the horses Midnight brought. He had accepted the role being offered, protector and healer, bridge between the wild world and human civilization. And in doing so, he had committed himself to a path that would demand everything he had once been and everything he might still become. The wounded veterinarian was finding his purpose. The isolated rancher was building connections. And the man who had thought himself beyond redemption was discovering that sometimes redemption arrived on 4 legs, carrying messages written in trust and sealed with impossible intelligence. Ahead, the Garrison farmhouse appeared on the horizon, small and weathered against the vast sky. Tom took a deep breath, preparing to meet Lucas Whitfield, to look into the eyes of a boy who had sent his most precious possession into the wilderness and trust it would find rescue. The conversation ahead would be difficult. The decisions that followed would be harder. But for the first time in 5 years, Tom Brennan felt ready. Not because he had healed, not because the grief had faded, but because something larger than his pain had called him back to life. And he had answered. The Garrison farmhouse sat at the end of a long dirt road that wound between hills covered in dormant prairie grass. The house itself was old but well maintained, white paint peeling slightly at the corners, a wraparound porch that sagged in the middle, and smoke rising from a stone chimney. As Dorothy pulled the truck into the yard, Tom saw an elderly woman standing on the porch, arms crossed, watching their approach with the careful assessment of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Helen Garrison, Dorothy said quietly, lost her husband 10 years ago to cancer. Raised 3 sons on this land, all of them moved away to bigger cities. She stays because this is home, and because she doesn't believe in running from what's hard. They climbed out of the truck, and Helen descended the porch steps with surprising agility for someone who had to be pushing 80. Dorothy Patterson, she said, her voice carrying across the yard. I was wondering when you'd show up. Her eyes shifted to Tom, sharp and evaluating. And you must be the veterinarian who's been hiding on the Brennan place. Tom Brennan, he said, extending his hand. Helen shook it with a grip that was firm and dry. Her hands were weathered from decades of ranch work, scarred and strong. You have something that belongs to Lucas, she stated, not a question. Tom nodded. Shadow. She's at my ranch, recovering. Helen studied him for a long moment, then turned and walked back toward the house. Come inside. The boy's been waiting. The interior of the farmhouse was warm and cluttered in the way homes become when they've been lived in for generations. Photographs lined the walls, family members frozen in time, and the smell of fresh bread filled the air. Helen led them through a narrow hallway to a small sitting room where a fire burned in the fireplace. Sitting in a worn armchair, looking far younger than his 16 years, was Lucas Whitfield. The boy stood when they entered, his posture stiff with nervousness. He was tall and thin, with dark hair that fell across his forehead and eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so young. He wore clothes that were too big for him, likely borrowed, and his hands twisted together in front of his body. Lucas, Helen said gently, this is Tom Brennan. He found Shadow. The boy's eyes widened, and for a moment Tom thought he might cry. Is she alive? She's alive, Tom confirmed, and watched relief flood the boy's face. She was in bad shape when she arrived, severe dehydration, hypothermia, early pneumonia. But she's responding to treatment. She's going to make it. Lucas sat down heavily, as if his legs had given out. Thank God, he whispered. I didn't know if I thought maybe. His voice broke and he looked away, struggling for composure. Tom moved closer and sat in the chair opposite Lucas. Why don't you tell me what happened? How Shadow ended up at my ranch? Lucas took a shaky breath and began to speak. His voice was quiet at first, then grew stronger as the story poured out. After his father died, everything had fallen apart faster than he could process. The funeral was barely over when Victor Ashford appeared, all sympathy and offers of help. He claimed to be a friend of James Whitfield, said he wanted to ensure the ranch was properly managed during the probate process. Lucas, overwhelmed and grieving, had signed papers he didn't fully understand, giving Ashford temporary access to the property to handle business matters. Within days, Ashford had moved in completely. He started selling off the horses, claiming they were part of settling the estate's debts. Lucas protested, showed him his father's handwritten will leaving everything to him, but Ashford dismissed it as legally insufficient without proper witnesses and notarization. He filed petitions with the county court, got himself appointed as administrator, and suddenly Lucas found himself with no legal standing in his own home. The horses disappeared one by one, sold to buyers Ashford claimed were legitimate but who Lucas suspected were connected to slaughter operations. His father's breeding records vanished. Equipment was auctioned off. The ranch was being systematically stripped. Lucas tried to fight back. He went to Sheriff Morrison, but the sheriff said his hands were tied, that the court had given Ashford authority and Lucas would have to challenge it through legal channels. Legal channels required lawyers, and lawyers required money Lucas didn't have. He reached out to his father's old clients, people like Helen Garrison, but most were afraid to get involved, worried about crossing someone as powerful as Ashford. A few helped quietly, giving Lucas places to stay, keeping him fed, but no one was willing to stand up publicly. Then 2 weeks ago, Lucas discovered what Ashford was really after. He overheard a phone conversation about Prairie Vista Estates, about water rights, about how the Whitfield land was the linchpin of the entire development. Ashford needed that aquifer, needed the springs that fed the creek, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get them. Lucas realized that if he lost the ranch, it wouldn't just mean losing his home. It would mean his father's entire legacy, 40 years of careful breeding and ethical practice, would be erased. Turned into luxury houses for wealthy people who didn't care about the land or its history. He decided to hide Shadow. She was the last foal from Sable Dream, the mare his father had spent 20 years perfecting. Shadow's bloodline was worth more than all the other horses combined, and her microchip contained registration information that proved the breeding program was legitimate and valuable. If Lucas could keep Shadow safe, if he could present her to the court as evidence that the ranch was still operational, he might have a chance to fight Ashford's claims. But hiding a foal wasn't easy. She needed care, feeding, protection. Lucas moved her from barn to barn, staying ahead of Ashford's men. But he knew it was only a matter of time before they found her. Then one night, 3 nights ago, Lucas was hiding Shadow in an abandoned line shack at the edge of the breaks when Ashford's men showed up. He didn't know how they had tracked him, but suddenly there were vehicles, lights, men with rifles. Lucas panicked. He knew if they caught Shadow, that would be the end. In desperation, he did the only thing he could think of. He released her, took off her lead rope, wrote a frantic note and stuffed it in her collar, and sent her running into the darkness. He hoped she would find her way to someone kind, someone who would read the note and help. It was a desperate gamble, born of terror and hopelessness. But Shadow didn't run alone. As Lucas watched from his hiding place, a massive black stallion appeared out of the night. Lucas recognized him immediately, Midnight's Echo, his father's prize stud who had escaped 2 years earlier. The stallion approached Shadow, and Lucas watched in amazement as Midnight seemed to assess the situation. The wild horse circled the foal once, then gently took her makeshift halter in his teeth and led her away, moving with purpose toward the west. Toward Tom's ranch, though Lucas didn't know that at the time. He only knew that something impossible had just happened, and he chose to believe it was his father's spirit, somehow guiding Midnight to save his daughter's last legacy. Tom listened to the entire story without interrupting, his mind reeling. Lucas's account confirmed everything he had suspected and added layers he hadn't anticipated. Ashford wasn't just greedy, he was calculating, using the legal system as a weapon to steal what he couldn't buy. And Midnight, the stallion, wasn't just intelligent. He was protective of his offspring in ways that transcended normal equine behavior. The horse had understood that Shadow was in danger and had taken action, deliberately leading her to the one human he knew could be trusted. When Lucas finished, silence filled the room. Helen Garrison stood by the fireplace, her face set in hard lines. Dorothy sat on the sofa, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Tom leaned forward, elbows on his knees, processing everything he had heard. Finally, he spoke. Shadow is safe and she's going to stay that way. But Lucas, you understand that keeping her safe means putting myself and my property directly in Ashford's crosshairs? Lucas met his eyes, and Tom saw steel beneath the boy's frightened exterior. I understand, and I'm sorry. I never meant to drag anyone else into this. I didn't know what else to do. Tom shook his head. Don't apologize. You did exactly the right thing. But now we need a plan that goes beyond just hiding. We need to go on offense. Dorothy leaned forward. What are you thinking? Tom stood and began to pace, his mind working through possibilities. Ashford's power comes from operating in the shadows, from the fact that most people don't know what he's doing. We change that. We make this public. We get the community involved, get people asking questions, demanding answers. We force everything into the light where he can't manipulate things as easily. Helen spoke up, her voice thoughtful. The county fair is in 3 days. Every rancher, every family within 50 miles will be there. If we could present Shadow, show people what's at stake, it might generate the kind of attention that makes Ashford's tactics harder to pull off. Tom nodded slowly. That could work, but it's risky. Ashford will be there too. And once we reveal that Shadow exists and is with me, he'll come after her immediately. Then we need protection, Dorothy said. Witnesses. People who will stand between Ashford and that foal. Tom looked at Lucas. Are you willing to stand in front of the whole county and tell your story? The boy's face was pale, but his voice was steady. If it means saving my father's ranch, I'll do whatever it takes. They spent the next 2 hours planning. Helen knew the fair organizers could arrange for Lucas to speak during the livestock exhibition. Dorothy had connections with several local ranchers who had been quietly uncomfortable with Ashford's land acquisitions and might be willing to support Lucas publicly if given the right push. Tom would bring Shadow, present her as evidence of the breeding program's value, and use his veterinary credentials to speak to her quality and the significance of her bloodline. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was something. A strategy that might shift public opinion enough to slow Ashford's momentum. As they prepared to leave, Lucas approached Tom. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was set. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for saving her, for believing me, for being willing to fight when you don't have to." Tom put a hand on the boy's shoulder, feeling the tension there, the weight he had been carrying alone. "I lost my family 5 years ago," Tom said, the words coming easier than he expected. "My wife and daughter. I spent those years hiding from anything that might hurt me again. But Shadow, she reminded me that some things are worth the risk. Your father built something that matters, Lucas. We're not going to let it be destroyed." The drive back to Tom's ranch was quiet. Dorothy seemed lost in thought, and Tom was processing everything he had learned. The scope of what they were attempting felt overwhelming. They were 3 people and a traumatized teenager going up against a man with money, political connections, and the legal system on his side. The odds were not favorable. But Tom thought about midnight, about the impossible intelligence in those dark eyes, about the trust the stallion had placed in him. If a wild horse could bridge the gap between species to ask for help, surely humans could find the courage to stand up to a bully. When they reached the ranch, Tom went immediately to the barn. Shadow was awake, standing near the stall door, and when she saw him, she nickered softly. Tom entered the stall and ran his hands over her, checking her condition. Her temperature was normal, her breathing clear. The antibiotics were working, and her body was responding to the nourishment and care. She was going to survive, but survival was only the first step. Now she needed to thrive, to become strong enough to be presented at the fair, to stand as living proof of Lucas's claim. He spent the afternoon working with her, coaxing her to eat more, leading her on short walks around the barn to build her strength. Shadow was surprisingly responsive, following his cues with an attentiveness that reminded him of her father. There was intelligence in her eyes too, a spark that suggested she understood more than a normal foal should. Tom found himself talking to her constantly, explaining what he was doing, why it mattered. He told her about Lucas, about the fight they were preparing for, about how important she was to so many people. And though he knew it was probably his imagination, he could have sworn she listened, really listened, processing his words with comprehension. As evening approached, Tom heard the sound of an engine and looked out to see Dorothy returning with Frank Drummond, the feed store owner. Frank was a solid man in his 60s with a weathered face and hands scarred from decades of physical labor. He followed Dorothy into the barn, moving with the careful respect of someone who had spent his life around livestock. "Dorothy said you might need some help," Frank said, his voice a low rumble, "and that there's a situation developing with Victor Ashford." Tom gave him the abbreviated version of events, leaving out the supernatural elements but including the core facts about Shadow, Lucas, and the threat to Whitfield Meadows. Frank listened without interrupting, then walked to Shadow's stall and studied the foal with an expert's eye. "That's quality breeding right there," he said finally. James Whitfield knew what he was doing. "Shame what's happening to that boy." He turned to Tom. "I'll stand with you at the fair, and I'll spread the word to other folks who might be willing to do the same. Ashford's made a lot of people uncomfortable with his land grabs, but nobody wanted to be the first to speak up. Maybe it's time someone did." Tom felt gratitude tighten his throat. "Thank you." Frank shrugged. "We're neighbors. That means something out here, or at least it's supposed to." That night, Tom again slept in the barn. He had brought a cot and blankets, setting up a makeshift bedroom in the tack room, but he spent most of the night sitting outside Shadow's stall, watching her sleep. His mind wouldn't quiet, running through scenarios, anticipating problems, trying to prepare for variables he couldn't predict. Around midnight, he heard something outside. Not the wind, but deliberate movement. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped into the cold. Midnight stood at the fence line, barely visible in the darkness except for the white star on his forehead. The stallion wasn't agitated, wasn't pounding or calling out. He simply stood, watching the barn, a silent guardian keeping vigil. Tom approached slowly, stopping a few feet from the fence. "She's getting stronger," he said quietly, his breath clouding the air. "Lucas is safe. We're going to fight for them both." Midnight's ears flicked forward, tracking Tom's voice. Then the stallion did something that raised the hair on Tom's arms. He bowed his head, lowering it until his nose nearly touched the ground, then raised it again. A gesture that in horse language could mean submission, but in this context felt more like acknowledgement. Perhaps even gratitude. Tom stood in the frozen darkness, facing a wild stallion who seemed to understand not just words but intent, and felt the full weight of what he had committed to. This wasn't just about saving a foal or helping a boy keep his inheritance. This was about standing against a kind of corruption that treated land, animals, and people as commodities to be exploited. This was about proving that small acts of courage could matter, that ordinary people could push back against concentrated power and greed. This was about everything Tom had once believed in before grief had stripped him down to nothing. He returned to the barn and sat on his cot, exhausted but unable to sleep. At some point Dorothy appeared with hot coffee and sandwiches, having somehow sensed he would need sustenance and company. They sat together in the warm barn, listening to the horses breathe, and talked about the days ahead. The fair was in 3 days. That gave them 72 hours to prepare, to reach out to potential allies, to make sure Lucas was ready to tell his story publicly. 72 hours to turn a desperate last stand into something that might actually work. "You know this could go badly," Dorothy said. "Ashford won't just accept defeat. He'll fight dirty." Tom nodded. "I know, but we fight anyway, because if we don't, people like him win by default." Dorothy smiled, tired but genuine. "James Whitfield would have liked you. He was stubborn too." They finished their coffee in comfortable silence. Then Dorothy left, promising to return at dawn with news from the community organizing efforts. Tom lay down on the cot and closed his eyes, but sleep remained elusive. His mind kept returning to midnight, to that impossible bow, to the understanding that had passed between man and horse. Somewhere in the hours before dawn, Tom finally drifted off. He dreamed of Emma, not as he usually did, frozen in the moment of her death, but alive and laughing, riding a black foal across endless prairie. In the dream she turned and waved at him, and her smile was the sun itself. When he woke, tears were on his face, but they didn't hurt the way they usually did. They felt almost like cleansing, like release. He rose and went to Shadow's stall. The foal was awake, standing strong, and when she saw him she walked over and pressed her head against his chest. Tom wrapped his arms around her neck and allowed himself to hope. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity. Dorothy proved to be a force of nature, reaching out to every contact she had built over decades in the community. Helen Garrison worked her own networks, calling in favors, reminding people of debts owed. Frank Drummond spread the word through the ranching community, and slowly, carefully, a coalition began to form. Not everyone was willing to stand publicly against Ashford, but enough people committed to being present at the fair, to witnessing whatever unfolded, that Tom began to believe they might actually have a chance. Lucas stayed hidden at the Garrison place, practicing his speech, preparing to face public scrutiny. Tom spoke with him by phone several times, coaching him on how to present facts clearly, how to stay calm under pressure, how to let his love for his father's work shine through the fear. The boy was stronger than he looked, Tom realized. He had his father's backbone, and now that he wasn't alone, that strength was emerging. Shadow continued to improve. By the second day she was eating normally, her coat beginning to shine, her movements gaining the fluid grace of a healthy young horse. Tom worked with her constantly, leading her, handling her hooves, getting her accustomed to being around people. She needed to be presentable at the fair, needed to show the quality breeding that made her valuable. But more than that, Tom wanted her to feel safe, to trust that the humans around her meant her no harm. He thought about Midnight, about how the stallion's trust had been earned through one act of kindness years ago. He wanted Shadow to carry that same trust, to know that not all humans were threats. On the third day, the morning of the fair, Tom rose before dawn and gave Shadow a thorough grooming. He brushed her coat until it gleamed like polished ebony, cleaned and oiled her hooves, fitted her with a simple halter that Dorothy had brought. The foal stood patiently throughout, seeming to understand the importance of the day. When Tom stepped back to look at her, he felt pride swell in his chest. She was beautiful, showing every bit of the quality breeding that ran in her veins. James Whitfield would have been proud. Dorothy arrived with the trailer, and together they loaded Shadow. The foal hesitated at first, then walked up the ramp with more confidence than Tom expected. Maybe she remembered being transported before, or maybe she simply trusted the humans who had cared for her. Either way, she settled into the trailer calmly, and Tom secured the gate. They pulled out of the ranch as the sun crested the horizon, painting the prairie in shades of gold and amber. Tom looked back once, half expecting to see Midnight watching from the fence line, but the stallion was nowhere in sight. Perhaps he was following unseen, or perhaps he trusted Tom completely now. Either way, his presence was felt even in his absence. The fairgrounds were already busy when they arrived, vehicles filling the parking areas, families streaming toward the exhibition halls and livestock barns. The county fair was the social event of the season, a chance for isolated ranching families to gather, compete, trade, and reconnect. Normally Tom would have avoided such crowds, but today he felt almost energized by the bustle. These were the people they needed to reach, the community that would ultimately decide whether Lucas kept his inheritance or lost everything to Ashford's greed. They unloaded Shadow in a temporary stall that Helen had arranged near the main exhibition arena. Within minutes, people began to stop and look. A few recognized the quality of the foal's breeding, commenting on her conformation, her bloodlines. Frank Drummond materialized with several other ranchers, forming a casual barrier around the stall that Tom realized was deliberate protection. Word was spreading that something significant was about to happen, and people were choosing sides before the main event even began. At 10 o'clock, Lucas arrived with Helen. The boy looked terrified but determined, dressed in his best clothes, his father's championship belt buckle at his waist. Tom pulled him aside. "You ready?" Lucas swallowed hard. "I think so." Tom gripped his shoulder. "Just tell the truth. Let people see what's at stake. That's all you can do." Lucas nodded, then walked to Shadow's stall. The foal recognized him immediately, pressing against the rails, making soft sounds of recognition. Lucas's eyes filled with tears, but he smiled. "Hey girl," he whispered. "I knew you'd be okay. I knew someone would help." The announcement came over the loudspeaker that the special presentation would begin in 15 minutes in the main arena. Tom, Dorothy, Lucas, and Frank moved as a group, leading Shadow through the crowds. People stopped to stare, whispers following them like wind through grass. Tom could feel the weight of attention, feel the moment building toward something that would either save Lucas or condemn him. They entered the arena to find it already half full, and Tom's heart sank. In the front row, sitting like a king holding court, was Victor Ashford. He was surrounded by men Tom didn't recognize, all of them dressed expensively, all of them watching with predatory interest. Next to Ashford sat Deputy Summers in full uniform, his presence a clear message about who held official power. But arrayed throughout the rest of the arena were faces Tom recognized from Dorothy's organizing efforts. Mrs. Garrison sitting with a group of elderly women, all of them wearing identical expressions of steel determination. Frank Drummond with at least a dozen other ranchers, their weathered faces set hard. Even Reverend Colby from the town church, positioned near the aisle, his presence lending moral authority to whatever was about to unfold. The battle lines were drawn, and Tom realized with a mixture of fear and exhilaration that there was no turning back now. The fair organizer, a nervous man named Walter Briggs, stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, We have a special presentation this morning concerning the Whitfield estate. Lucas Whitfield has requested the opportunity to address the community, and in the interest of fairness, we've agreed to hear him out. Lucas stepped forward, and the arena fell silent. For a moment the boy just stood there, frozen by the weight of so many eyes. Then he looked at Shadow, at the foal who represented everything his father had built, and began to speak. His voice shook at first, but grew stronger as he told his story. He spoke of his father's dedication to ethical breeding, to building bloodlines that honored the quarter-horse heritage. He spoke of Ashford's arrival after the funeral, of the systematic stripping of the ranch, of the legal maneuvering that had left Lucas powerless to stop it. He spoke of Shadow, of how she represented the culmination of his father's life work, and of how he had been forced to send her into the wilderness to save her from Ashford's greed. His words were simple, unpolished, but they carried the weight of truth, and the arena listened with rapt attention. When Lucas finished, Ashford stood. The man's face was composed, but Tom could see rage simmering beneath the surface. "A touching story," Ashford said, his voice smooth and dismissive. "But let's deal with facts. James Whitfield died without a proper will. The property is in probate. I was appointed by the court to manage the estate, which I have done responsibly. This boy has interfered with legal proceedings, hidden assets, and now he's trying to manipulate public sympathy to avoid the consequences of his actions." He gestured toward Shadow. "That foal is property of the estate, which means it's under my management. I demand it be turned over immediately." Tom stepped forward before he could second-guess himself. "Shadow isn't going anywhere." Ashford's eyes fixed on him, cold and calculating. "Mr. Brennan, I wondered when you'd make your position clear. You're harboring stolen property. That makes you liable for prosecution." Tom held his ground. "Shadow isn't stolen. She was released by her rightful owner and found refuge on my property. I've cared for her as any veterinarian would for an animal in distress. And now she stands as evidence that Lucas has a legitimate claim to his father's ranch. A claim you've been trying to erase through legal manipulation." The arena erupted in murmurs. Ashford's facade cracked slightly. "You have no idea what you're interfering with, Brennan. This is bigger than one boy and one horse. This is about progress, about moving this county into the future." Tom felt anger rising, clean and righteous. Progress built on theft isn't progress. It's just theft with better marketing. Ashford turned to Deputy Summers. "Arrest him. Confiscate the animal." The deputy stood, but before he could move, Reverend Colby rose from his seat. His voice rang through the arena with unexpected authority. "On what charge, Deputy? Caring for an injured animal? Protecting a minor's inheritance? Since when is doing the right thing a crime in this county?" Other voices joined in, people standing, shouting questions, demanding answers. The arena descended into controlled chaos, and Tom realized that Dorothy's organizing had worked better than he dared hope. The community wasn't united, but enough people were questioning Ashford's narrative that the man's absolute control had been broken. Ashford raised his hands, trying to restore order, but the moment had slipped away from him. Walter Briggs returned to the microphone, his voice shaking. I think this matter needs to be resolved through proper legal channels, not at a county fair. Mr. Ashford, unless you have a court order, I can't authorize the seizure of Mr. Brennan's property." Ashford's face went dark with fury. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He looked at Tom. "Not by a long shot." Then he turned and strode from the arena, his entourage following. Deputy Summers lingered for a moment, looking uncertain, then followed as well. The arena remained in an uproar, people talking, arguing, debating, but Tom barely heard it. He was focused on Lucas, who stood trembling beside Shadow, tears streaming down his face. The boy looked up at Tom with an expression of disbelief and hope mixed together. Did we win?" Tom put his arm around the boy's shoulders. "We bought time, and we showed people the truth. That's something." The aftermath of the county fair presentation rippled through Ridgeway like stones thrown into still water. Tom returned to his ranch with Shadow and Lucas, the boy having nowhere else safe to go and Tom unwilling to let him out of his sight. Dorothy followed in her truck, and together they established what amounted to a vigil, a constant watch over the foal and the teenager who represented everything Victor Ashford wanted to destroy. The first night passed without incident, though none of them slept well. Tom kept his rifle within reach, ears straining for the sound of vehicles approaching. Lucas stayed in the barn with Shadow, refusing to be separated from her, and Tom didn't have the heart to insist otherwise. Morning brought unexpected visitors. Sheriff Dale Morrison arrived alone, without his deputy, and the expression on his weathered face was troubled. He accepted the coffee Dorothy offered and stood in Tom's kitchen, turning the mug in his hands without drinking. "I need to talk to you about what happened yesterday," Morrison said finally. Tom leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Are you here to arrest me?" The sheriff shook his head slowly. "I'm here because I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I've seen a lot of things I'm not proud of. What's happening to the Whitfield boy, that's one of them." Morrison set down his coffee and met Tom's eyes. "Ashford showed up at my office this morning with a lawyer and a stack of paperwork. Court orders, injunctions, writs I don't even fully understand. He wants Shadow seized as estate property. He wants Lucas placed in protective custody. He wants you charged with obstruction and interference." The sheriff paused. "I told him I'd look into it, but between you and me, I'm not moving fast on any of that." Tom felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. "Why not?" Morrison's jaw tightened. "Because I talked to Judge Henshaw last night. Turns out Ashford's appointment as estate administrator was rushed through on an emergency petition that Judge Henshaw barely reviewed. Now that there's public attention on the case, Henshaw's taking a closer look at the entire situation. He's not happy about being used." Dorothy leaned forward from her seat at the table. "What does that mean practically?" "It means," Morrison said, "that Lucas has a window to file his own petition challenging Ashford's authority. If he can get legal representation and present his case properly, there's a chance the court will reverse the administrator appointment and recognize Lucas as the rightful heir. But that takes time, and it takes money for lawyers." Tom thought quickly. "How much time do we have?" Morrison shrugged. "Days, maybe a week if we're lucky. Ashford knows the judge is reconsidering, so he'll push for quick resolution on his existing orders. If Lucas doesn't file his challenge before those orders are executed, it won't matter what the judge thinks later." Tom looked out the window toward the barn where Lucas was grooming Shadow, the boy's movements gentle and practiced despite his exhaustion. "We need a lawyer. A good one." Dorothy stood. "I'll make calls." James Whitfield had friends in Lincoln, lawyers who handled his breeding contracts. "Someone will help." Morrison finished his coffee and moved toward the door. "I'll slow walk Ashford's orders as much as I can. But Tom, you need to be prepared for the possibility that I'll have to serve them eventually. My job means something to me, even when it conflicts with what's right." Tom nodded understanding. "I appreciate the warning. Just give us as much time as you can." After Morrison left, Tom went to the barn. Lucas was sitting in the straw beside Shadow, the foal's head resting in his lap. The boy looked up when Tom entered, and the exhaustion on his young face was heartbreaking. "Is the sheriff going to take her?" "Not today," Tom said, "but we're running out of time. Lucas, we need to talk about legal options." The boy's expression hardened. "I don't have money for lawyers. My father left some savings, but Ashford froze all the accounts. Said they were part of the estate." Tom sat down in the straw across from him. "Dorothy's working on that. But I need to know something. If we fight this and lose, if Ashford gets Shadow and the ranch, what will you do?" Lucas was quiet for a long moment, his hand stroking Shadow's neck. "My dad used to say that the measure of a man isn't whether he wins or loses, it's whether he stands up when standing costs him everything." He looked at Tom with eyes that held no illusions. "If we lose, at least I'll know I fought. That's more than I'd have if I just gave up." Tom felt pride swell in his chest. "Your father raised you right. They're not taking her without a fight." The rest of the day passed in tense anticipation. Dorothy made call after call, tracking down lawyers, explaining the situation, pleading for help. Most were sympathetic but unwilling to take on a case against someone as connected as Victor Ashford. Finally, late in the afternoon, she got a callback that changed everything. Patricia Mills, the veterinarian who had taken over Tom's practice, had connections to an advocacy group that handled cases involving agricultural fraud and elder exploitation. The group was interested in Lucas's case, particularly the aspects involving Ashford's manipulation of the probate system. They agreed to take it pro bono if Lucas would allow them to use it as a test case for reforming county administrator appointments. It wasn't perfect, but it was a chance. Dorothy drove to Lincoln that evening to meet with the lawyers and begin preparing paperwork. Tom stayed at the ranch with Lucas, both of them understanding that they were likely in the calm before a storm. That night, Tom sat on his porch watching the stars emerge. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and his breath formed clouds that disappeared into the darkness. He thought about the past week, about how completely his life had been upended by a wild stallion's desperate plea. He thought about Emma and Rebecca, about how they would have loved this fight, would have thrown themselves into it without hesitation. He wondered if somehow they had guided Midnight to his gate, had orchestrated this entire chain of events to pull him back from the edge of permanent withdrawal. It was a comforting thought, even if logic rejected it. Movement at the edge of his vision made him turn. Midnight stood at the fence line, barely visible in the starlight except for that distinctive white star. Tom rose and walked toward the stallion, moving slowly, hands visible. The horse didn't retreat. When Tom reached the fence, Midnight lowered his head and breathed across his palms, the gesture now familiar. Tom spoke quietly into the darkness. "She's safe for now. We're fighting for her. I don't know if we'll win, but I promise you this. They won't take her without going through me first." Midnight lifted his head and looked toward the barn where Shadow slept. Then the stallion did something extraordinary. He turned and called out, a sound that echoed across the prairie, and from the darkness other horses emerged. The same group Tom had treated days earlier, plus others he hadn't seen before. They formed a loose perimeter around Tom's property, spreading out in a wide circle, taking up positions like sentries. Tom stared in disbelief as at least 20 wild horses arranged themselves in what could only be described as a defensive formation. They weren't agitated or nervous, just watchful, positioned as if standing guard. Midnight looked at Tom, and in that gaze was a communication clearer than words. "We protect our own." The stallion was telling him that Tom and Lucas weren't alone in this fight. Whatever happened, the horses would be watching. Tom felt emotion tighten his throat. He nodded once to Midnight, acknowledging the gift of that protection, then returned to the house. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with his rifle across his knees, keeping his own watch while Midnight's herd kept theirs. The next morning brought Dorothy back from Lincoln with news both good and troubling. The lawyers had filed an emergency petition challenging Ashford's administrator appointment and requesting an immediate hearing. Judge Henshaw had agreed to expedite the case, scheduling a hearing for 2 days hence. That was the good news. The troubling news was that Ashford had responded by filing his own motion to immediately seize Shadow as endangered estate property. He claimed Lucas was incapable of caring for her, that the foal's presence at Tom's ranch constituted theft, and that every day of delay reduced the estate's value. The judge hadn't ruled on that motion yet, but time was running out. Tom, Dorothy, and Lucas spent those 2 days preparing. The lawyers needed documentation, photographs, veterinary records proving Shadow's condition when she arrived and her improvement under Tom's care. They needed character witnesses who could speak to Lucas's capability and maturity. They needed financial experts who could testify to the breeding program's value and viability. Dorothy coordinated everything with military precision, calling in favors, organizing volunteers, building a case brick by brick. Tom provided detailed medical records, documenting every treatment, every improvement in Shadow's condition. He took photographs showing her transformation from near death to healthy foal, evidence that would demonstrate both the quality of care she had received and Lucas's wisdom in trusting Tom with her safety. Lucas worked with the lawyers, rehearsing his testimony, learning how to present facts clearly under pressure. Tom watched the boy grow more confident with each practice session, saw the steel in James Whitfield's son beginning to show through the fear and grief. On the evening before the hearing, Tom found Lucas in the barn, standing at Shadow's stall. The boy wasn't crying, but his eyes were wet. "What if we lose?" Lucas asked without looking at Tom. "What if tomorrow the judge says Ashford was right and takes her away?" Tom moved to stand beside him. "Then we'll have done everything we could. And that matters, Lucas. Win or lose, you stood up. Your father would be proud." Lucas wiped his eyes. "I keep thinking about what my dad would do. He always said the land and the horses were a trust, not a possession. That we were caretakers for something bigger than ourselves. If Ashford gets the ranch, he'll destroy all of that. Turn it into houses and lawns and forget everything it used to be." Tom thought about his own losses, about how places and memories could be erased. "I won't lie to you, Lucas. Sometimes the bad guys win. Sometimes people with money and power get what they want regardless of what's right. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. It means we fight harder and we make sure that even if they win, they don't win easily. We make them work for it, and maybe that slows them down enough that next time, someone else can stop them." The morning of the hearing arrived cold and bright. Tom dressed in the only suit he still owned, a black garment that hung loose on his frame after 5 years of minimal eating and hard physical work. Lucas wore borrowed clothes that almost fit, his father's belt buckle polished to shine. Dorothy drove them to the county courthouse, a solid brick building that dominated Ridgeway's small downtown. The parking lot was already full when they arrived, and Tom realized that half the county had turned out to witness the hearing. Frank Drummond stood on the courthouse steps with a group of ranchers, their presence a silent statement of support. Helen Garrison waited near the entrance with other elderly women who had known James Whitfield. Even Reverend Colby was there, his clerical collar visible above his winter coat. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls standing. Judge Henshaw, a stern man in his 70s with iron-gray hair and penetrating eyes, surveyed the crowd with obvious displeasure. "This is a legal hearing, not a circus," he announced. "Anyone who cannot maintain decorum will be removed." Victor Ashford sat at the plaintiff's table with 2 expensive lawyers, his expression confident. He glanced at Tom and Lucas with a smile that was all edges, a predator certain of his kill. The hearing began with Ashford's lawyers presenting their case. They argued that James Whitfield's handwritten will was legally insufficient, that Lucas was a minor incapable of managing a complex business, that the estate was being mishandled, and that Shadow's removal from the property constituted theft that had damaged the estate's value. They presented documents, financial statements, expert testimony, building a case that sounded reasonable and logical. Tom watched Lucas's face pale as the arguments mounted, saw the boy beginning to lose hope. Then it was their turn. The advocacy group's lead attorney, a sharp woman named Margaret Cross, stood and methodically dismantled Ashford's case. She presented evidence that Ashford had sold estate property below market value to associates, about his father's legacy, about the breeding program built over decades, about Shadow's significance as the last offspring of champion bloodlines. He spoke about Ashford's manipulation, about being forced to hide, about the desperate decision to release Shadow into the wilderness rather than watch her be sold or destroyed. His voice cracked several times, but he didn't break. He looked directly at Judge Henshaw and said the words that would echo in Tom's memory forever. "Your Honor, I'm not asking you to give me something I don't deserve. I'm asking you to protect something my father spent his life building. Shadow isn't just a horse. She's proof that ethical breeding matters, that patience and care can create something valuable and beautiful. If Mr. Ashford gets her, all of that ends. Please don't let that happen." The courtroom was silent when Lucas finished. Even Ashford's lawyers seemed uncertain how to respond. Judge Henshaw studied the papers before him for a long moment, then looked up. "This court has reviewed the evidence presented by both parties. While I acknowledge that proper probate procedure requires adult oversight of minor inheritances, I am troubled by the haste with which Mr. Ashford was appointed and by evidence suggesting his management has not been in the estate's best interest. Therefore, I am suspending Mr. Ashford's authority as estate administrator pending a full review of his financial handling. Lucas Whitfield is granted temporary custody of the property and all assets, including the foal known as Shadow, under the supervision of a court-appointed trustee who will ensure proper management until Lucas reaches majority. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. People cheered, others argued, but Tom heard none of it. He was focused on Lucas, who sat frozen in the witness chair, tears streaming down his face. The boy looked at Tom with an expression of disbelief and overwhelming relief, and Tom nodded, smiling through his own emotional response. They had won. Not completely, not permanently, but they had won enough. Shadow was safe. Lucas had his chance. The legacy would survive. Ashford stood abruptly, his face dark with rage. He leaned across the table toward his lawyers, speaking in harsh whispers, then turned and looked directly at Tom. The hatred in that gaze was palpable, a promise that this wasn't over. But for now, in this moment, Tom didn't care. They had bought time, had proven that ordinary people standing together could challenge power and win. Outside the courthouse, Lucas was surrounded by supporters, people congratulating him, offering help, promising to spread the word about his victory. Tom stood slightly apart, watching, feeling something that might have been happiness stirring in his chest. Dorothy appeared beside him, her eyes bright. "We did it," she said. "Actually did it." Tom shook his head. "Lucas did it. And his father, by building something worth fighting for. We just helped him stand up." Dorothy squeezed his arm. "Don't diminish what you did, Tom Brennan. You gave that boy hope when he had none. You risked everything to protect a stranger's legacy. That matters." They returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Lucas rushed to the barn to see Shadow, and Tom followed more slowly, savoring the moment. Inside, the foal greeted Lucas with obvious joy, pressing against the stall rails, nickering. The boy wrapped his arms around her neck and sobbed, all the fear and tension of the past weeks finally releasing. Tom gave them privacy, stepping back outside where the cold air felt clean and sharp. Movement at the fence line caught his eye. Midnight stood there, and Tom could swear the stallion looked satisfied. The wild horses that had kept watch were gone now. Their vigil ended. But Midnight remained, bearing witness to the victory his actions had made possible. Tom walked to the fence. "We won," he said simply. "She's safe. Lucas keeps the ranch. Your daughter has a future." Midnight tossed his head, mane flying in the evening breeze. Then the stallion did something Tom would remember for the rest of his life. He stepped forward and pressed his forehead against Tom's chest, a gesture of trust and connection that transcended species. Tom raised his hands and rested them on either side of the great horse's head, and for a moment they stood like that, two beings who had found understanding across the divide that separated human from animal. Then Midnight stepped back, reared once in silhouette against the sunset, and galloped away toward the breaks. Tom watched until the stallion disappeared into the landscape, then returned to the barn. Lucas was sitting in the straw with Shadow, looking exhausted but peaceful. Tom sat down beside him. "What happens now?" Tom asked. Lucas smiled slightly. "I rebuild. Get the ranch operating again, start breeding properly, honor what my dad started. It's going to be hard. I don't know everything yet, but I'll learn." Tom nodded. "You'll need help." Lucas looked at him hopefully. "Would you, I know you have your own place, but maybe you could advise me? Help with the veterinary side?" Tom thought about his small ranch, about the isolation he had chosen, about the 5 years he had spent hiding from life. Then he thought about Emma, about how she would have loved being part of something like this, about how Rebecca would have pushed him to say yes. "I'll help," Tom said. "We'll figure it out together." That night, Tom returned to his own house for the first time in days. The rooms felt empty but not lonely, filled with the quiet that comes after purpose has been fulfilled. He made coffee and sat at his kitchen table, looking at the photographs of Emma and Rebecca that he had finally allowed himself to display again. "I did something good," he told them. "I saved something that mattered. I stood up when it counted." He hoped, wherever they were proud. He hoped they understood that while he would always grieve them, he was finally ready to live again. Not to replace them, never that, but to honor their memory by being the man they had believed him capable of being. The weeks that followed brought gradual restoration. Lucas moved back to Whitfield Meadows with Tom's help, beginning the slow work of rebuilding. Shadow thrived, growing stronger each day, showing the intelligence and spirit of her father. Tom divided his time between his ranch and the Whitfield property, finding in the work a sense of purpose that had been missing for 5 years. Dorothy continued organizing, building a network of support that would help Lucas navigate the challenges ahead. Victor Ashford, facing investigation into his estate management and possible fraud charges, disappeared from the area. Rumor had it he had moved operations to another county, seeking easier prey. On a morning in early spring, Tom stood at his fence line and watched as midnight appeared on the ridge. The stallion was not alone. Beside him walked Shadow, now nearly full-grown, her coat gleaming in the sunlight. Lucas had released her weeks ago, trusting that she would find her way, and she had. She had chosen the wild, chosen her father's world, but she returned periodically to the ranch, bridging the gap between human and horse civilization. Tom watched as father and daughter stood together on the ridge, magnificent and free, and felt completion settle in his chest. The circle had closed. The broken veterinarian had found redemption. The orphan boy had reclaimed his inheritance. The wild stallion had saved his daughter. And in doing so, all of them had discovered that family wasn't defined by blood or species, but by the willingness to stand together against darkness. Tom turned back toward his house, where coffee waited and a day of honest work stretched ahead. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined him. He was more than his loss now. He was a man who had chosen to fight, to care, to risk. He was a man who had answered a supernatural call and found his humanity restored. He was finally enough. In the distance, midnight called out one last time, the sound carrying across the prairie like a promise that some bonds transcend understanding, that trust once given is never forgotten, and that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from moving on, but from standing still and letting life find you again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.